Federal agents unraveled most of the plot, and the ringleaders were eventually brought to justice. But Abdul Rahman Yassin, the man who built the bomb, slipped away. He reappeared later in the Middle East, the guest of Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. 1993, Mogadishu, Somalia. When American troops tried to seize a troublesome warlord, a running gun battle erupted in the heart of the city.
Bill Clinton did worse than nothing. Why is it worse than nothing? Is because in Somalia, that attack, within days he went on the air and said he were pulling U.S. troops out of Somalia. That indicated that the American government had a glass jaw. In 1994, we were lucky. A plot to assassinate the Pope, a plot to assassinate Bill Clinton, and a plot to simultaneously blow up 11 U.S. air carriers over the Pacific were all foiled by some sharp-eyed policemen in Manila, the Philippines.
1996. Another explosion. This one at the Khobar Towers housing complex in Saudi Arabia. 19 Americans were killed. Louis Freeh led an FBI team to search for the perpetrators, eventually pointing the finger of blame at Hezbollah, the terrorist network funded and directed by the Islamic regime in Iran.
During the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was still the rival power, it became very well known in the Middle East that if you did something to annoy the Russians, punishment would be swift and dire. If you did something against the Americans, not only would there be no punishment, there might even be some reward, as the anxious procession of diplomats and congressmen and journalists and professors came running to say, oh, what have we done to offend you? What can we do to put it right? That perception has not entirely disappeared.
Defense Secretary William Perry vowed to take a firm line against terror after the attacks at Khobar. His pronouncements were mocked by Osama bin Laden, the exiled Saudi terror leader. When tens of your soldiers were killed in minor battles and one American pilot was dragged in the streets of Mogadishu, you left the area carrying disappointment, humiliation, defeat, and your dead with you. The extent of your impotence and weakness became very clear. James Woosley served as President Clinton's first CIA director.
We had a policy in the 90s and in the 80s of generally responding to terrorist attacks solely by law enforcement. Once in a while, a president would decide to drop some bombs or fire some cruise missiles at somebody from afar. President Reagan did it in '86 against Libya. President Clinton did it in '98. But none of those was particularly successful, I don't think. And instead of really moving solidly against the countries that were backing terrorism, we basically just sent the lawyers.
In August 1998, truck bombs tore apart the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. 224 innocent people, nearly all of them African workers, were killed. Bin Laden's propaganda was growing more bold, glorifying jihad in Bosnia, in Chechnya, in Kashmir. Violence and mayhem in slick packaging sold outside mosques from Riyadh to London to Los Angeles.
In their way of thinking, they were creating slowly and incrementally the image of a big, fat, smug, luxurious, tired West that either could not or would not strike back.
No longer a simple gang, Al-Qaeda had transformed into a small army. Thousands of young Arab men had journeyed to Afghanistan to swear their loyalty to bin Laden and his holy war against the non-Muslim world. President Clinton fired cruise missiles into Al-Qaeda's Afghan training camps after the embassy bombings in 1998. The feeble response only fueled the legend of bin Laden.
And because on other occasions, Beirut in 1983, Somalia, as you mentioned, in 1993, we would, after being hit, we would leave. I think we convinced people like Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein in the 80s and 90s, the rulers in Tehran, that we were both cowardly and somewhat feckless.
Aden, Yemen, October 2000. In the waning months of the Clinton administration, Al-Qaeda struck again. 17 American sailors were killed aboard the USS Cole, victims of bin Laden's weapon of choice, the suicide bomber. Once again, the FBI was dispatched. Once again, answers were slow in coming, and once again, the attack proved a propaganda windfall for Al-Qaeda.
The war on terrorism shouldn't have started on September 12th. It should have started perhaps in February of '93 when they bombed the Trade Center the first time, or maybe in '95 when they attacked us in Riyadh, or '96 in Al-Qabar, or '98 in Kenya and Tanzania, or perhaps when they attacked the Cole. Or maybe we can take it back to '85 when they threw Leon Klinghoffer off the boat, the Achille Lauro. This element has only grown. It's grown because we have not fought it. We have to fight the element now.
In December of 2001, American bombers carved slow circles in the skies over eastern Afghanistan. Tora Bora, the final battle of the Afghan campaign. It was an astonishing victory. The Soviet Union had lost more than 15,000 men and had killed more than 1 million Afghans trying to tame this land. But just a few hundred American soldiers and some dazzling air power had routed its Taliban government. Afghanistan had been, in many ways, an idyllic home for the Arab fundamentalist movement. Here they had fought for their vision of the world, a society dragged back to the Middle Ages. Pure religion enforced at the point of a gun. It was a vision embraced across a growing segment of Arab and Islamic society. A vision that Osama bin Laden and his admirers intended to force on the rest of the world with an unrelenting campaign of terror and violence.
Al-Qaeda is both an organization and, in a sense, an ideology. And I think we're having better luck dealing with the top level of the organization than, particularly after the Afghan war, than we are with the ideology.
I felt a bad premonition on the 14th of February 1989 when the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a death sentence and a life sentence in one go by pronouncing his fatwa on Salman Rushdie. In other words, the theocratic head of a foreign state offers money in his own name for the suborning of murder, for the writing of fiction by someone who isn't a citizen of his country, and does it in the name of God. I thought, well, this is a warning. And I noticed then that some people didn't want to take it either. They said, oh, well, he shouldn't have upset them by writing a novel.
In December of 2001, President Bush and his war cabinet turned their eyes west from Afghanistan, because the 19 hijackers of 9/11 were not Afghans. The vision of 9/11 was hatched in the Middle East, and it was there that the White House turned for answers. In their diagnosis of the problem, George Bush's advisors agreed with the United Nations. The Arab world was falling further and further behind its neighbors, politically, economically, and socially. Virtually all of the region's people lived under dictatorial governments. The Arab world's oil wealth was being squandered, its intellectual capital wasted. And within those failing societies had grown violent new strains of fundamentalist Islam.
In this so-called age of globalization, what one person, even what a group of people, what one tribe does can affect everybody, and that empowers those groups. So a Mohammed Atou in this new postmodern age can get on a plane dressed as a Westerner, use an ATM card, and almost take out the capital of the United States of America. And psychologically, it emboldens them because they realize that even though the Arab world is a small fraction of the entire world's population, and economically and socially not significant, by its sheer parasitic, nihilistic propensities, it can blackmail, bribe, threaten the West.
The White House and the United Nations also agreed on a cure for the problems of the Middle East: more democracy and more women's rights. But there was one key difference. After 9/11, George Bush was prepared to fight for a new Middle East. The United Nations had become a force for the status quo.
It's not sufficiently appreciated, I think, how much of a break with the Republican tradition this is. For the United States to make war on a status quo that it used to uphold is, for me, a very great change for the better. We can't live with the status quo that produced Al-Qaeda. wonderful. It's good to be a revolutionary again.